Welcome to Crossover Commander, where we show you how to cross over your favorite pop culture characters through the blind eternities so they can command your deck with style. If you really enjoy what you see here today and would like to see this channel grow, check us out on TikTok and Patreon. The links will be in the description section down below. It looks like this portal is stabilizing, so let's get on with this show. Scarecrow, otherwise known as Dr. Jonathan Crane, is one of the more deranged supervillains in Batman's rogue gallery. Has been known to speak in nursery rhymes from time to time, and tortures his victims with their own fears. To that end, I'd like to present Scarecrow the Magic card. For 3, a blue and a black. He's a nightmare horror, and Scarecrow gets +1/+1 for each card your opponent owns in exile, and whenever Scarecrow or another nightmare or horror enters the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land card. Now, I don't know about you, but there's nothing scarier in a game of Commander than losing your entire deck before you've gotten to play it. Now, the rule 0 in power level for this deck: if Scarecrow has enough Fear Toxin, he can win the game by turn 6. If not, he will fray your opponent's sanity by turn 12. And for the strategy, Scarecrow plays on your opponent's nightmares of not having a deck. Scarecrow slices through your opponents with commander damage to claim his victory. This is the perfect time to remind you that this is a crossover themed build. With that being said, crucial cards for the theme will be added regardless of price. Cards that are not essential to fit the theme will be made as budget friendly as possible. Before we delve into Gotham's Nightmare, we have to check out the land base. We've got Sunken Hollow, Rogue's Passage, Myriad Landscape, Hostile Hostel, Demir Aqueduct, Command Tower, Choked Estuary, Temple of Deceit, Bojuka Bog, Drowned Catacombs, 13 Swamps, and 12 Islands. We're also going to be running Soul Ring, Talisman of Dominance, Arcane Signet, and Thought Vessel. This is where our opponent's nightmares begin. We start with Pilipala for 2 generic. It has flying and the ability to and untap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. It combos with the Grand Archivist to give you infinite mana. For 1 and 2 blue, other blue creatures you control get +1/+1. And then it has, for a blue, target artifact creature becomes blue until end of turn. And then you can tap an untapped blue creature you control to add 2 generic mana. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. So you tap the Pilipala with the blue to gain you that, then you untap it with the 2 and you gain infinite mana that way. You'll use that infinite mana to play Increasing Confusion for X and a blue. Target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. If Increasing Confusion was cast from a graveyard, that player puts twice that many cards into his or her graveyard instead, and has a flashback cost for X and a blue. And then Sphere of Annihilation for X and a black. Sphere of Annihilation enters the battlefield with X void counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile Sphere of Annihilation, and all creatures and planeswalkers with mana value less than or equal to the number of void counters on it, and all creatures and planeswalker cards in graveyards with mana value less than or equal to the number of void counters on it. And then we run Curse of Swine for X and 2 blue. Exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 2/2 green boar creature token. And then Fascination for X and 2 blue. Choose 1. Each player draws X cards, or each player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. And then Drown in Dreams for X, 2, and a blue. Choose 1. If you control a commander, as you cast the spell, you may choose both. Target player draws X cards, and target player mills twice X cards. And then Mass Manipulation for XX and 4 blue, gain control of X target creatures or planeswalkers. Having stepped into our opponent's nightmares, we can take control of all they fear. We start with Banehound for 1 black. It's a Nightmare Hound, and it has lifelink and haste. And then Mesmeric Fiend is a Nightmare Horror for 1 and a black. And when Mesmeric Fiend enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand, and you choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. It will return if Mesmeric Fiend leaves the battlefield. Then we have Wharf Infiltrator for 1 and a blue is a human horror, has Skulk. And whenever Wharf Infiltrator deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. And whenever you discard a creature, you may pay 2. If you do, put a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creature token onto the battlefield. And then the Brain Maggot for 1 and a black. When Brain Maggot enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand, and you choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card until Brain Maggot leaves the battlefield. Then we have Sinuous Vermin for 1 and a black. It's a rat horror. And for 3 and 2 black, it has Monstrosity 3. As long as Sinuous Vermin is monstrous, it has Menace. And then Foul Watcher for 1 and a blue is a Nightmare Bird. It has Flying. And when Foul Watcher enters the battlefield, you surveil 1. And it has Delirium. Foul Watcher gets +1/+0 as long as there are 4 or more creature or card types in your graveyard. And then Gluttonous Slug for 1 and a black is a slug horror and has Menace and Evolve. And Despoiler of Souls for 2 black is a horror and cannot block. And for 2 black, you can exile 2 other creature cards from your graveyard, return Despoiler of Souls from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then Yarok's Fenlurker for 2 black is a horror, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card from their hand. And for 2 and a black, Yarok Fenlurker gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And then the Thing in the Ice for 1 and a blue is a horror with Defender, and it comes into the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, remove an ice counter from Thing in the Ice. Then if it has no ice counters on it, transform it. And when you transform it, it acts as a nice board wipe, a one-sided board wipe. And then Underworld Charger for 2 and a black is a Nightmare Horse. And Underworld Charger can't block and has Escape. For 4 and a black, exile 3 other cards from your graveyard, and you can cast this card. And then Underworld Charger gets, when it escapes, it gets +2/+2. And then Plague Mare for 1 and 2 black can't be blocked by white creatures, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents get -1/-1 until end of turn. And then we have Falthus for 2 and a black as a Nightmare Cat. Commanders you control have Menace and Death Touch. And then we have a sidekick of the Scarecrows. Fright for 1 and 2 blue is a horror, and whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may return it to its owner's hand. And whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And then, for some reason, the Riddler's here as well. For 2, a blue and a black. Whenever you cast a spell, exile a blue spell, exile the top card of target player's library. And whenever you cast a black spell, exile the top card of target player's library. Your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as cards exiled with Riddler. I wonder what he's up to being here. Then we have Hell's Caretaker for 3 and a black. It's a horror, and it has tap, sacrifice a creature, return target creature card from your graveyard to play. Play this ability only during your upkeep. Then we have Ravenous Chupacabra for 2 and 2 black. It's a beast horror, and when Ravenous Chupacabra enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. And then the Skyclave Shadowcat for 3 and a black is a cat horror, and you can pay 1 and a black to sacrifice another creature to put a 1/1 counter on the Skyclave Cat. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you draw a card. And then the Slum Reaper for 3 and a black is a horror. And when Slum Reaper enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. And then the Flesh Writher for 2 and 2 black is a horror with the ability Transfigure for 1 and 2 black. You can sacrifice this creature and search your library for a creature card with the same converted mana cost as this creature and put that card into play. Then shuffle your library. You can play this only as a sorcery, though. Then we have Dread Presence for 3 and a black. It's a nightmare, and whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control, you choose one, draw a card and lose a life, or Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. Then we have Faceless Butcher for 2 and 2 black. It's a nightmare horror, and when Faceless Butcher comes into play, remove target creature other than Faceless Butcher from the game, and when Faceless Butcher leaves, return that removed card to play under its owner's control. And then Mage Hunter for 3 and a black. It's a horror creature, and whenever an opponent casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, they lose 1 life. And then Consuming Aberration for 3, a blue and a black is a horror. And Consuming Aberration's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyard. And whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card that then puts that many cards into the graveyard. Then we have Dread Slaver for 3 and 2 black. It's a zombie horror. And whenever a creature dealt damage by Dread Slaver this turn dies, return it to the battlefield under your control. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. And then Sludge Monster for 3 and 2 blue is a horror creature. And whenever Sludge Monster enters the battlefield or attacks, put a slime counter on up to 1 other target creature. Non-horror creatures with slime counters on them lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 2. And then Nemesis of Reason for 3, a blue and a black. Whenever Nemesis of Reason attacks defending player, put the top 10 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. That's a Leviathan horror. And then the Dinrova horror for 4, a blue and a black. As whenever Dinrova horror enters the battlefield, return target permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card. Then to top off this nightmare, we have Screaming Swarm for 5 and a blue. It's a bird horror with flying, and whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, target player mills that many cards. And for 2 and a blue, put Screaming Swarm from your graveyard into your library, second from the top. And then Doomweaver for 4 and 2 black is a spider horror with reach and soulbound, and as long as Doomweaver is paired with another creature, each of those creatures has, when this creature dies, draw cards equal to its power. And then Toxrill the Corrosive for 5 and 2 black is a legendary slug horror, and at the beginning of each end step, put a slime counter on each creature you don't control. And creatures you don't control get -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. And whenever a creature you don't control with a slime counter on it dies, create a 1/1 black slug creature token. And for a blue and a black, you can sacrifice a slug to draw a card. And then the worst nightmare that any Magic player can think of is Jin-Gitaxias Korogger for 8 and 2 blue. It's a Praetor, and it has flash, and at the beginning of your end step, draw 7 cards, and each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. As Scarecrow once said, at the end of fear, there is oblivion. These cards will help us protect Scarecrow and or give him extra abilities in order to end the game even quicker. We start with Planar Void for 1 black. Whenever a card is put into a graveyard, remove that card from the game, essentially making sure that any card dying or getting discarded is immediately exiled, pumping up the Scarecrow. And then Blade of Selves for 2 generic mana. Equipped creature has Myriad, and the equip cost is 4. Now the way this works with Scarecrow is his trigger is on ETB. So when the copies of him ETB, you choose to sacrifice the copies and keep the original, but then you'll still be able to exile a bunch of cards from your opponent's libraries. And then Lightning Greaves for 2 generic mana. Equipped creature has Haste and Shroud. And then Swiftfoot Boots for 2 generic. Equipped creature has Hexproof and Haste. Then we have Maddening Cacophony for 1 and a blue, and a kicker cost of 3 and a blue. Each opponent mills 8 cards, and if this spell was kicked, instead each opponent mills half their library rounded up. And then Windfall for 2 and a blue. Each player discards their hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. And then Psychic Corrosion for 2 and a blue. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. This works incredibly well with Windfall. Say if the highest number of cards in hand was 7, then each player draws 7 cards, and then each of your opponents is going to mill 14 cards from the Psychic Corrosion. And then Memory Erosion for 1 and 2 blue. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Then we have Cunning Rhetoric for 2 and a black. Whenever an opponent attacks you and or one or more planeswalkers you control, exile the top card of that player's library, and you may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. This will give us access to a lot of our opponent's fears. Whisper Silk Cloak for 3 generic. Has an equipped cost of 2, and an equipped creature can't be blocked, and has Shroud. This will help Scarecrow get in for some lethal commander damage. And then Tasha's Hideous Laughter for 1 and 2 blue. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with total mana value 20 or more. And then Bite into Fossa for 2 and 2 blue. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. And for 1 blue, creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able. Helm of the Host also pairs incredibly well with Scarecrow. Once we've broken our opponent's psyche, there's no telling how many Scarecrows are actually there. For 4 generic mana, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except that token isn't legendary if the equipped creature is legendary. And then Perilous Vault for 4 generic. You can pay 5 and then tap it. Exile Perilous Vault and exile all non-land permanents. And then Leyline of the Void for 2 and 2 black. If Leyline of the Void is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. And then Startled Awake for 2 and 2 blue is a sorcery, but it's an odd one. It says target opponent puts the top 13 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. And then for 3 and 2 blue, put Startled Awake from your graveyard onto the battlefield transformed. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. Then it comes back as a spirit, and when it hits an opponent, it bounces back to your hand. So you can do this multiple times. And then Reflections of Letargia for 4 and a blue. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. In our case, we'll be choosing either Nightmare or Horror. And whenever you cast a spell of the chosen type, you copy that spell. Now this is going to be awesome because whenever a Horror or Nightmare creature enters the battlefield, you're going to get that trigger off of Scarecrow. So this is going to double that up. And then Shadow's Verdict for 3 and 2 black. Exile all creatures and planeswalkers with converted mana cost 3 or less from the battlefield, and all creatures and planeswalkers with converted mana cost 3 or less from graveyards as well. So this can make Scarecrow huge. And then Mind Unbound for 4 and 2 blue. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a lore counter on Mind Unbound, then draw a card for each lore counter on it. And then Mind's Dilation for 5 and 2 blue. Whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. If it's a non-land card, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. Now that we've broken our opponent's minds with our nightmare fuel, we can check out the average price of this deck. At time of release, it's between $179 and $246 depending on where you purchase from. As always, if you're willing to play with heavily played or damaged cards, it can be cheaper than that. And then the stats for this deck, we've got 7 ramp, 1 tutor, 9 card draw spells, and as far as interaction goes, it's a question mark because we're removing our opponent's libraries. So all of their threats, anything that they can play, they might not be able to. And then for the things that do manage to hit the board, we've got 7 board wipes and 35 lands. Remember, this is a crossover themed build. With that being said, crucial cards for the theme were added regardless of price. Cards that were not essential to fit the theme were made as budget-friendly as possible. If you want to optimize this list, feel free to leave your upgrades in the comments section below. Most importantly, this deck is meant to be a new and engaging way to spice up your Commander games, so fun is the top priority. Thank you for watching this crossover deck tech. If you liked this video, check out our other content on YouTube or TikTok. Your viewership means the multiverse to the crossover commander, and if you would like to become a part of this growing Terran reality, you can like, share, and subscribe. If you would like to vote on the next pop culture character to crossover, check out our Patreon where we have some awesome perks. If you have any ideas or complaints, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. Now that this portal's closing, see you next time.